How does it feel to be the main English language editor of Xi Jinping, The Governance of China, the book on the Chinese president's governance philosophy? A Scotsman named David Ferguson knows a thing or two about that. A law graduate, he moved to China 15 years ago, and in 2014 he became involved in editing the English version of The Governance of China, which has been published in 3 volumes and distributed and read worldwide. How did he fall in love with Chinese books and culture? How does he feel about the current China bashing by the international media, and what motivates him to communicate Xi's unique governance philosophy to English readers? Earlier, I talked to David Ferguson in our Beijing studio. Mr. Ferguson, thank you so much for accepting
I'm delighted to be
our
here.
interview.
Thank you.
Thank you. So tell us a bit, how did you get involved exactly with editing for this, one of the most important books in today's China? And how much did you know about Xi Jinping's philosophy or his thoughts before you got involved?
Well, that's a good question. I started work with CIPG, China International Publishing Group, back in 2008. I came down to Beijing and I began first as a journalist and an editor working for China.org, which is the web-based news and information provider. So I worked first of all as a journalist, writing and editing articles, which were mostly quite brief. So there were obviously a fair amount of political material in there, but they were short articles. I moved to Foreign Languages Press in 2010. And Foreign Languages Press basically does the same job, but with books rather than journalism. So then I started working on more substantial material. I did a number of white papers. I think going back all the way to the 2011 Defence White Paper was the first one that I did.
Yeah.
I did a wide variety of books, and some of the books I worked on were political. But the truth of the matter is, until I actually started working on the Xi Jinping books, I did not have a very clear idea at all about Xi Jinping thought. And I think, to be fair, nobody really did. Outside of the higher echelons and the closer circles of the CPC, Xi Jinping thought had not yet started to take shape. So it was really when I became involved in editing the first book that I started to get to grips with Xi Jinping thought. And of course, from then on, I've gone on to edit books 2 and book 3.
So these are, I actually, you know, these are huge volumes,
Yes.
and I only have the Governance of China Volume 2 here, the English version, and the Chinese version. As our audiences can see, these are copious books, and this one, 560, 70 pages, and obviously it's a lot of work to edit these. I understand you have read all 3 volumes 5 times.
Yes, about 5 times.
About five times.
5 times.
Wow, you must have a very good knowledge inside out about what these books are. But tell us some of the most striking ideas in his books that stood out for you.
Well, it's very interesting. The books contain a lot of theoretical and conceptual material, because Xi Jinping thought starts right at the top with the Chinese dream, and it works through a lot of levels. You've got things like the 2 centenary goals, you've got 4 comprehensives, the 5-pronged development strategy. So you've got all of these conceptual blocks. But if you go down to the grassroots, then you start talking about things like the Belt and Road and poverty alleviation and the anti-corruption campaign. And that is where people are actually doing stuff. And it's probably the easiest parts to grasp, because now you're talking about actual things happening rather than the conceptual or the theoretical framework that supports them. So these are the things that I find most interesting. I think that each of them is a massive challenge. Poverty alleviation is the biggest effort that has ever been made in the history of humanity.
Yes.
Corruption is something that's been endemic in all societies, not only for centuries but for millennia. And the Belt and Road is a massive, massive undertaking. So certainly together, these 3 pillars of Xi Jinping thought, they represent, I would think, as big a challenge as Chairman Mao faced when he was trying to found the PRC. They represent as big a challenge as Zhou Enlai and Deng Xiaoping faced when they were fighting the Cultural Revolution. And they represent as big a challenge as Deng Xiaoping faced when he was trying to launch reform and opening up. So they're a massive undertaking, very ambitious, huge in their scope. And I think they rank up right up there with some of the biggest challenges that China has faced since the start of the PRC.
As someone who has read all of that, who was involved in editing all of that, are you able to give one character or one feature that defines the doctrine or the philosophy of President Xi on governance?
I would look at it in a slightly different way. I think the founding inspiration behind the governance of China actually goes back to Xi Jinping's youth. During the Cultural Revolution, he was sent out to the countryside. As an educated youth, he was sent to the countryside near Yan'an. Now, I've been to Yan'an. I haven't been to the countryside, but I've been to the city, and I've seen the caves that people live in there. And I've seen modern caves. Knowing what the country was like
Well, if you
then,
talk about cave, just for those who don't have an idea, they're not literally caves in the mountain. They're a kind of traditional homes which is carved into the
they're carved into the rock.
mud.
Yeah. It's actually we call them caves, but they are homes. They're literally homes that are carved into the bedrock.
Yes.
And thinking about what life must have been like at that time, when China was poorer than sub-Saharan Africa, and Xi Jinping was living in one of the poorest parts of the land, he was literally eking out an existence. And this man, from the age of 14, for 7 years, he in these conditions.
Biting his hardship times.
Yeah. And he made it through that. And I think that it's very clear from the way he thinks and the way he writes and the things that he talks about, it's clear how much of a formative experience that was on him. And it couldn't be otherwise. I mean, as I say, I've been there, I've seen it, I've tried to imagine what it must have been like 40, 50 years ago, and it must have been a very, very hard life indeed.
Yeah.
And for him to come through that and to go back out to the countryside, which he did, proves that he's a very substantial person. And I think that is actually what the core of the governance of China comes from.
A very strong resolve, I would say,
yes, absolutely.
to bring the fate of China about from a impoverished country to a strong country. Now, I know, just now you've already mentioned like the four-pronged development strategy, the five-point strategy for the international audience. Even for the Chinese audience, it's quite hard, I would say. And, it also has to do with translating traditional Chinese sayings. I would guess a lot of them into English. So what are some of the struggle that you had to translate these Chinese lines into English and make it, easy to understand and interesting at a minimum level?
Well, you've already put your finger on it. I mean, there's nothing in it that is easy. But one of the most difficult parts is dealing with axioms. Axioms are fundamental to China's political discourse. And by axioms, I mean things like the three represents and the four-pronged strategy and the four malfeasances.
Why do they have to use that? I mean, why don't they just come up with something that, like in the Western discourse, a few words?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think you have to bear in mind the history of the thing. It dates back to imperial times when the emperor would bestow his favour on you by writing an inscription, and that I think is the historical origin of these axioms. But they play a very, very important and fundamental part in China's political discourse, and communicating this to an international, in particular a Western audience, is very, very difficult for three reasons. One is a psychological reason, because politicians in the West, when they come up with stuff like this, it's just a soundbite. It's for tomorrow's headlines and nothing more.
Yeah.
I mean, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister of the UK, his big idea was the big society. And it was Konghua. It was the perfect example of empty
But that's
words.
something people can grasp for the moment, that something people can take away instantly, and you hit the headline. But not the Chinese.
That's all it is. But in the West, it's just a soundbite for tomorrow's headlines. The problem is that Western people think of China in the same way. They think that all these axioms are just more empty words. It doesn't actually occur to them that there's something very substantial and
Why do
solid
the
behind
Chinese
them.
not even aim at making the headline? Because if you don't...
Well, I will try to answer your question because it's a very good question. And again, you're
But go ahead, please. Yeah.
you're putting your finger on it. But there are three problems. One of them is the psychological problem.
Yes.
These are just meaningless sound bites. The second one is it's a language problem. Whenever the Chinese come up with one of these things, it's always a number and it's always a word. And for some reason, the word that they choose in Chinese is never a word that translates into English as a countable noun. So you've got verbs and you've got adjectives and you've got adverbs, you've got uncountable nouns, all being pressed into service as countable nouns. And they just don't translate. Like the three stricts and the three earnests, strict and earnest, they're adjectives. The four comprehensives, comprehensive is an adjective. The three represents a verb. And it never seems to be a countable noun.
Okay,
so it doesn't translate. So it doesn't translate well into English, and it looks clumsy and it looks awkward. The third one is what you were really getting at. It's in terms of meaning. That the Chinese culture values obscurity, opaqueness, subtlety, being indirect, never saying what you mean. None of these things ever say what they are. You can't look at it. The three represents, you could look at the three represents for 100 years. You could look at these words and not know what it means. And that is fundamentally difficult when you're working with the governance of China, because so much of it, so much time is spent referring to these axioms, and they are vitally important.
Then, to your understanding, why does the Chinese leadership, why do the writers of these books or similar books stick to this tradition, knowing that it's difficult to be translated into the international audience, but why do they stick to this tradition?
One of the most senior people, very, very respected figure in Chinese translation circles, he's spoken to me about this, and he said to me, do you know what we should do? We should write them in English first. Now that might sound very shocking to a Chinese ear, but as China plays a more and more important role on the international stage, more and more of their discourse is going to be in English. So you're actually right. They should start out by saying, how do we make this accessible to an international audience, which is a relatively easy thing to do, and then turn it back into Chinese.
That was part one of my conversation with David Ferguson, the main English language editor of Xi Jinping, the governance of China. We'll bring you the second part in the near future. With that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.